This video was made possible by the generous support of my patrons. If you would like to join them in helping grow this channel, you can do so at the links in the description below. Relations between the United States and the People's Republic of China are at their lowest point in decades, with trade disputes, technological rivalries, and geopolitical flashpoints dominating headlines. Yet while the media spotlight rests on Washington and Beijing, Canada's trajectory with China has been just as strained, and in some respects, even more hostile. What historically began as a pragmatic relationship rooted in trade, development, and cautious cooperation has in the past decade hardened into one marked by suspicion, sanctions, and national security narratives. The arrest of Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou in 2018, carried out at the behest of the United States, was a turning point in Canada-China relations, plunging bilateral ties into an ongoing diplomatic crisis. After Meng's arrest and China's arrest of two Canadian nationals in response, Canada continued to take a more confrontational posture towards the People's Republic. In 2019, it raised human rights concerns regarding Beijing's crackdown on so-called pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong, and in February 2021, Canada became one of just 9 countries to pass a non-binding motion that declared China was committing a genocide against its Uyghur minority population in Xinjiang. From here, the media was given the green light to paint China in broad strokes as a national or even a global threat. This was the political climate of xenophobic hysteria through which careful legal assessment gave way to manufactured political consensus, while baseless and outlandish accusations were allowed to flourish. No other case study demonstrates this better than Canada's moral panic and witch hunt surrounding accusations of Chinese foreign interference.
New details have emerged about alleged Chinese interference.
Foreign interference. Chinese foreign interference.
Chinese foreign interference.
Chinese interference.
Foreign interference.
Foreign interference.
Foreign election interference. Foreign interference.
Foreign interference, particularly from China.
Help us defend our democracy from foreign interference.
The foreign interference scandal was a political controversy in which intelligence agencies, the media, and politicians fueled a moral panic surrounding supposed Chinese meddling in Canadian elections. At the center of the scandal was CSIS, which provided journalists with anonymous leaks that were often reported as verified facts, even though no solid evidence was ever produced. What was presented as a defense of democratic institutions ultimately eroded their credibility, and in the end, it wasn't China that weakened Canadian civil society, but the very actors claiming to protect it: politicians, intelligence agencies, and the media, who inflicted lasting damage without facing any accountability. In this video, we will take account of this scandal and analyze how it unfolded through media narratives, intelligence leaks, and political opportunism, and expose the deeper dynamics of Canadian power, both at home and abroad. On November 7, 2022, Global News published a bombshell report alleging that the Chinese government had secretly interfered in Canada's 2019 federal election. The piece, authored by investigative journalist Sam Cooper, claimed that Beijing had orchestrated a vast campaign involving a clandestine network of operatives working to undermine Canadian democracy and sovereignty by covertly funding 2019 election candidates. Citing leaked information from the Canadian Security Intelligence Service, or CSIS, Cooper alleged that China had covertly funneled money to election candidates sympathetic to Beijing's interests, inserted agents into MPs' offices, co-opted former officials, and even organized targeted campaigns to intimidate or punish politicians seen as hostile to the People's Republic. Cooper's article presented excerpts from CSIS briefs as though they were established facts. One section quoted the intelligence service directly, saying that the Chinese Communist Party is using all elements of state power to carry out activities that are a direct threat to our national security and sovereignty. According to Cooper's reporting, the Communist Party of China's United Front Work Department, an organization tasked with cultivating influence abroad, was at the heart of this alleged operation. The most explosive claim was that the Chinese consulate in Toronto had directed $250,000 in funds through intermediaries to a network of at least 11 federal elections candidates and their associates in order to secure leverage within Canada's political system.
Yes, what we found is that China has been very successful undermining Canada using something that they called the United Front. This is an influence and espionage network. How it works is they target elite Canadian leaders, institutions, they offer sweet business deals, and really they end up using trade with China as a weapon. Experts say the effect is some Canadian leaders, influential groups, end up advocating for China's policy. For example, the court case of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou, or they fail to criticize China's human rights abuses. And in this way, Canada's democratic values are being undermined. Experts in Canada say this type of corruption has to be happening with regards to China's interference. Really, it's just a question of the scale and whether Canada has the legal tools to expose and prosecute these cases. At this point, we have strong recommendations in front of Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's government, and experts say that it remains to be seen whether Ottawa will act on these recommended measures.
Wow.
Okay.
That's quite the investigation.
Thanks so much
for joining us.
For Cooper, this was not an isolated story, but part of a larger narrative that he had been developing for years. Back in April 2020, during the heights of the COVID-19 pandemic, he had accused Chinese diaspora communities in Canada of acting as a fifth column by hoarding personal protective equipment on Beijing's behalf through United Front channels. In October 2021, shortly before his interference stories, he published a series of reports linking the People's Republic of China to alleged money laundering in Vancouver casinos, thereby framing Chinese networks as both a political as well as criminal threat. These earlier reports, and similar ones across all of Canadian mainstream media, laid the groundwork for what was now portrayed as proof of China's long-term infiltration of Canadian society and governance. But Cooper's election interference allegations were far more dramatic than his earlier ones. Unlike his pandemic or casino stories, this time Cooper provided names, dates, and figures, alleging not just shadowy influence, but direct participation in Canadian elections. This gave his reporting an aura of specificity and urgency that quickly grabbed public attention. On November 16, 2022, Cooper continued to build momentum when he published another global news story, this time naming Wei Chengyi, the owner of the Foodie Mart supermarket chain with locations in Ontario and British Columbia. Cooper accused Wei of playing a central role in the covert scheme that allegedly facilitated large financial transfers designed to advance Beijing's interest in Canada's 2019 federal election. Although Cooper never revealed the full list of the 11 candidates supposedly implicated in the CSIS leaks, in addition to Wei Chengyi, he also singled out Liberal MP Han Dong, portraying him as a witting affiliate of Chinese influence efforts. In February 2023, once again citing anonymous sources, Cooper alleged that Dong had close ties to officials at the Chinese consulate in Toronto, that irregularities had marred his 2019 Liberal nomination contest, and that Chinese international students had been coerced into voting for him using falsified addresses. Cooper further linked Han Dong to Michael Chan, a prominent Ontario politician and later mayor of Markham, whom CSIS has reportedly flagged as a person of concern. Stories of Chinese interference started to pick up traction and circulate widely in Canadian media and political circles, but the story gained even more traction in early 2023 when the Globe and Mail, Canada's most influential national newspaper, published a front-page article with bold black text on a blank white background reading, "CSIS documents reveal Chinese strategy to influence 2021 election." The authors Robert Fife and Stephen Chase maintain that Beijing's interference efforts went beyond 2019 and claim that China employed a sophisticated strategy to disrupt Canada's democracy in the 2021 federal election campaign, as Chinese diplomats and their proxies backed the re-election of Justin Trudeau's Liberals, but only to another minority government, and worked to defeat conservative politicians considered to be unfriendly to Beijing. From this point forward, the allegations snowballed until they dominated national discourse. Between February 2023 and February 2024, Fife and Chase at the Globe and Mail published more than 117 articles on alleged Chinese foreign interference, greatly expanding the scope of the controversy. For example, on February 28, 2023, they exposed the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation for accepting a $200,000 donation from a Chinese national. In March, they claimed that the Chinese consulate in Vancouver interfered in the mayoral election to prop up Ken Sims, a Chinese-Canadian Liberal candidate. And in May, they claimed that Conservative MPs Erin O'Toole and Michael Chong, as well as NDP MP Jenny Kwan, were being targeted by China. It is important to note that no direct evidence was ever produced to substantiate these claims, and every individual named denied the allegations outright. None admitted wrongdoing. The Confederation of Toronto Chinese Canadian Organizations, representing Wei Chengyi, said that the accusations against him were nonsense. No, we are never involved in those allegations. Don't use those allegations without evidence. Han Dong also defended himself from these media attacks, responding that, "I am unaware of the claims provided to you by alleged sources, which contain seriously inaccurate information." Mayor of Markham, Ontario, Michael Chan, also told the media, "This sort of vague innuendo is impossible to respond to. To the extent you are suggesting I am not a true Canadian, you should be ashamed of yourself." Vancouver Mayor Ken Sims said that, "If there's proof of foreign interference in our election, I want to know about it because I'm a Canadian. But right now, there are a bunch of insinuations." Beijing also weighed in. The Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs rejected the claims, urging Canada to stop making remarks detrimental to China-Canada relations, insisting that China had no interest in Canada's internal affairs. The Chinese consulate in Vancouver also added that the Chinese side has made it clear on many occasions that China has always adhered to the principle of non-interference in the internal affairs of other countries, and has never interfered in any Canadian election or internal affairs in any way. The relevant Canadian media's practice of spreading false information about the consulate general and consular officials, and attacking China's domestic and foreign policies with its ulterior motives and malicious intentions, will damage the friendship and interests of the peoples of China and Canada. Furthermore, seriously disrupt the consulate's performance of consular functions. As media coverage of alleged Chinese foreign interference spread like wildfire, what began as a handful of allegations confined to intelligence briefings or whispers of suspicion quickly mutated into a full-blown political scandal, fueling headline news, parliamentary debates, public inquiries, and widespread fears that Canadian democracy itself was under siege. The members of Parliament who were told that they were being targeted were rarely informed of this by CSIS, but often learned about their targeting through the media. They were provided little insight on what it meant to be targeted, what they were targeted for, and how they were being targeted. The simple implication that Canadian MPs might be falling under the sway or influence of Beijing was enough to prompt political action from those being targeted.
CSIS has informed Conservatives Michael Chong, Erin O'Toole, and now New Democrat Jenny Kwan that they have all been singled out by the Chinese Communist Party.
CSIS had reached out to me.
Kwan says she can't go into details about how China is targeting her, only why.
The reason why I'm being targeted is because of my activism in support and to fight for basic human rights.
This turned Parliament into a theater of suspicion, where the spectacle of accusations carried more weight than evidence. The political fallout from this scandal was like a gift to the Conservative Party. It not only allowed Conservative politicians to blame China as a convenient scapegoat if they lost elections, but the media reports provided a constant source of ammunition against the Liberals. For Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, the scandal offered endless opportunities to hammer away at Prime Minister Justin Trudeau in daily question period theatrics. Every session became a spectacle of accusatory questions. What did you know about Chinese foreign interference? When did you learn of it? Why didn't you act sooner? What didn't you tell Canadians? What are you hiding?
He is perfectly happy to let a foreign authoritarian government interfere in our elections as long as they're helping him.
It didn't matter how Trudeau answered, whether he denied, clarified, or deflected. The Conservatives could frame the Liberals as either negligent or complicit. And therefore, for them, the truth of the allegations was irrelevant. What mattered was the political mileage they could extract from this scandal. While the Conservatives demonstrated a general disinterest in legislative reform, one of the loudest voices on this front was Jenny Kwan of the New Democratic Party. Despite the NDP's posturing as a progressive alternative to the Liberals or Conservatives, Kwan called for a sweeping public inquiry and amending legislation to give the intelligence community greater power. Her call to not only investigate interference, but also name and shame MPs supposedly compromised by hostile foreign states captured the climate of paranoia. She declared, "I believe we must find a way to disclose who are the MPs knowingly, intentionally, wittingly, or semi-wittingly engaging with foreign states or their proxies to undermine Canada's democratic processes and institutions. If there continues to be no consequences for MPs who knowingly help foreign governments act against Canadian interests, we will continue to be an easy target."
Let's just set aside partisan politics for just 1 minute. And why the NDP, right from the get-go, when this issue came up, said that we have to have a national inquiry into this foreign interference. Why the NDP moved the motion back in February in committee, gave notice, and that motion, after much filibustering by some members of this House. And the worst thing of it all is Canada's democracy gets undermined. Something that I cherish, and that I do not take for granted. Because my parents, where they came from, my grandparents, where they came from, did not have that right to democracy. Chinese people had to die and go to war to fight for that democracy here in Canada.
Her push for punitive measures helped pave the way for Bill C-70, which made amendments to modernize the Canadian Security Intelligence Service Act. Tabled in June 2024 and rushed through Parliament with unanimous support, the law made it a criminal offense to engage in surreptitious or deceptive conduct at the direction of or in association with a foreign entity with the intent to influence Canadian politics or democratic rights. Critics immediately warned that the language in Bill C-70 was dangerously vague and hastily produced under a toxic political climate of accusations, fear, and hate-mongering. Under its provisions, almost any form of dissent could be construed as foreign interference. A Canadian who opposes Ottawa's policy on China, Palestine, or elsewhere could be accused of representing foreign interests, or furthermore, businesses engaged in legitimate trade with Chinese companies, which CSIS insists are all tied to the Communist Party, could suddenly find themselves painted as collaborators. In essence, Bill C-70 blurred the line between espionage, political disagreement, and everyday Canada-China relations, while turning freedom of speech and association into potential national security risks. The foreign interference scandal demonstrated that accusations alone, regardless of evidence, were enough to damage reputations and shape public discourse. Although no one has yet been prosecuted under Bill C-70, it sets an ominous precedent by providing a legal framework for this same accusatory logic to be weaponized not only by the media, but by the state. Throughout the scandal, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau attempted to walk a fine line. If he downplayed the threat, he appeared complicit, but if he responded too adamantly, he risked appearing as caving to the anxieties of the opposition parties. He initially dismissed the media reports as overblown, but still conceded that China was playing aggressive games with Canadian democracy. However, this balancing act collapsed under political pressure, and in an attempt to clear his government of suspicion, he unilaterally launched an independent inquiry into foreign interference on March 15, 2023. The first phase of Canada's response was not a public inquiry, but a special rapporteur process, overseen by David Johnston, a former Governor-General, well regarded by all three major parties for his record of public service. Unlike Parliament, Johnston was granted exclusive access to classified intelligence, enabling him to review the raw materials underlying the allegations. Johnston released his initial report on May 23, 2023, which sought to weigh the credibility of the intelligence against the accusations that had fueled the political and media outrage. His conclusions were strikingly cautious and in several cases directly contradicted the prevailing narrative. For example, on the question of alleged Chinese-linked financing of candidates, Johnston emphasized the uncertainty of the evidence. He said, "There is uncertainty about whether there was money, if it actually went to the staff or the provincial MPP, and there is no intelligence suggesting any federal candidates received these funds." Similarly, in response to claims that Beijing had coordinated a network of candidates during the 2019 and 2021 elections, Johnston was unequivocal. "My conclusion is that there was no evidence presented to any minister or the Prime Minister that any of the 11 candidates or group of candidates were working together as part of a network. No recommendation about a network of candidates was made, as no network was known to exist. No recommendation was ignored." Johnston also directly addressed one of the most politically explosive allegations, that China had attempted to engineer a liberal minority government in 2021 to block a conservative victory. His assessment again undermined the charge. He said, "There was no indication that the PRC had a plan to orchestrate a liberal minority government in 2021 or were determined that the Conservatives not win." After reviewing a great deal of classified intelligence, he concluded that the evidence suggested no need for a public inquiry. These findings were consistent with previous investigations conducted by various agencies. The Office of the Commissioner of Canada Elections had already closed almost all files related to alleged interference in 2019 and 2021 due to a lack of evidence. The RCMP had also launched several probes into issues potentially related to foreign interference, but filed no charges. The Security and Intelligence Threats to Elections Task Force, created to monitor election integrity, said that potential threats did not meet the threshold for further investigation. Even the House of Commons Standing Committee on Procedural and House Affairs found itself unable to substantiate the more dramatic claims. While Johnston's review did not validate the media's most dramatic claims, it did underscore the ambiguity of intelligence reporting, the lack of definitive evidence, and the absence of proof that Beijing sought to rig Canadian election outcomes. But Johnston's cautious report did not resolve the controversy. It simply shifted its focus. Conservatives and much of the media pounced, not on his findings, but on his credibility to conduct an impartial investigation. They emphasized his personal ties to the Trudeau family and even dredged up anecdotes about ski trips together to paint him as hopelessly biased. For the opposition, the lack of evidence was proof, not of innocence, but of a cover-up.
Is Justin Trudeau's ski buddy, his cottage neighbor, his family friend, and a member of the Trudeau Foundation, which got $140,000 from Beijing. He has a fake job, and he's unable to do it impartially. He needs to simply hand it over and allow an independent public inquiry into Beijing's interference.
Their appointed rapporteur, David Johnston, does not have the confidence of this House. He must go.
Thus, the scandal continued to spiral. Allegations that had already been shown to lack substance were now being replaced by allegations of political corruption within the inquiry itself. The Conservatives were likely aware by this point that the original charges were baseless, but nevertheless milked this cow for every ounce of political gain that it would yield. It wasn't until Justice Marie-Josée Hogue, appointed in a more bipartisan manner, completed a comprehensive review of the evidence that the dust finally began to settle. Her 7-volume report confirmed what Johnston and multiple bodies had already concluded. She wrote that while China does in fact exercise various forms of soft power within Canadian civil society, it did not undermine the integrity of our electoral system. The scandal, which had dominated headlines and parliamentary debates for nearly 2 years, ultimately collapsed under the weight of its own lack of evidence. But by then, the damage was already done. Legislation had been passed, reputations tarnished, and public trust in Canadian institutions eroded. What started as whispers of interference ended as a national moral panic, one that revealed far more about Canadian politics than it ever did about China. The three journalists most responsible for amplifying allegations of Chinese foreign interference, Sam Cooper, Robert Fife, and Stephen Chase, leaned heavily on purported leaks from CSIS. These leaks were then presented as exclusive disclosures that lifted the veil on Beijing's covert operations in Canada and the government's alleged negligence in responding. As doubts arose about the credibility of reporting, both Global News and the Globe and Mail sought to bolster the legitimacy of their stories through secondary channels of authority. Former CSIS officials, China experts, and intelligence veterans were frequently invited to comment on the air, offering the impression of insider knowledge to validate the claims leaked to the press.
Some political experts have said China is using race to forward its agenda. One of those experts is my next guest.
This symbiotic media intelligence relationship blurred the line between independent journalism and institutional advocacy, especially as commentators often frame speculative scenarios as looming dangers. Over time, a pattern emerged where possibilities were treated as probabilities and probabilities were narrated as certainties, not because of fresh evidence, but because repetition across outlets and platforms endowed the allegations with an aura of factuality.
And if this goes unchecked and there are no criminal consequences and there are no diplomatic consequences, then where does this continue to go? How much more interference could we see?
In the span of a few months, the Canadian public was immersed in a media environment where unverified intelligence fragments became the backbone of a moral panic. At the same time, Canada's major media outlets reinforced and magnified the narrative through opinion columns, editorials, and long-form background stories. Calls for sweeping new measures, such as the creation of a foreign influence registry, the imposition of tougher sanctions on China, and the launch of broad parliamentary inquiries, became recurring themes across editorial pages. Parallel reporting on Beijing's military posture in Taiwan, the suppression of Hong Kong's so-called pro-democracy movement, and the widely circulated allegations of genocide against Uyghurs in Xinjiang produced a dramatic backdrop. To Canadian audiences, the foreign interference scandal was not about abstract geopolitics. It was reinforced by recent crises. The arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver in December 2018, followed by Beijing's retaliatory detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, the two Michaels, had already plunged Canada-China relations into their most serious crisis in decades. Taken together, this broad discursive landscape, combining global human rights concerns, regional flashpoints, and direct bilateral ties, rendered allegations of Chinese interference in Canadian politics both plausible and inevitable in the public imagination. Yet the foundation of the election interference narrative was remarkably fragile. The entire controversy rested on anonymous leaks from within CSIS, attributed to unnamed intelligence officials whose identities, motives, and credibility were, and continue to remain, entirely opaque, as public audiences were told nothing about the nature or the source of the leaks. Analysts speculated across the spectrum, with some believing that they were the work of a lone wolf insider, acting without authorization, while others suspected a deliberate effort from higher levels of CSIS to shape media and political discourse. But the reality is that nobody knows, because no investigation or public inquiry has ever been launched into the origins, intent, or internal politics behind the leaks. What is clear, however, is that the most alarming claims circulated by the press did not withstand scrutiny. Both David Johnston's 2023 report as Special Rapporteur and Justice Marie-Josée Hogue's 2024 public inquiry suggest that the leaks had been either exaggerated or misinterpreted, and that the evidence did not support the narrative of systematic Chinese subversion of Canadian democracy. University of Victoria sociology professor Midori Ogasawara argues that the foreign interference scandal exposes a deeper structural problem in the relationship between intelligence agencies, the media, and the public. Her critique highlights three central issues that come to light when unverified intelligence leaks become the raw material for journalism. First, leaks are presented as facts when they are not. Intelligence is not a finished, verified product. It is by nature partial, fragmentary, and provisional. Analysts often disagree on interpretation, and context is crucial. Consider, for instance, an intercepted email documenting a money transfer between a Canadian-Chinese businessperson and a firm in China. On its own, such a fragment could mean many things: a legitimate business deal, an ordinary donation, or, if viewed with suspicion, evidence of covert interference. The point is that absent the broader context, and instead filtered through a political climate already primed by a history of xenophobic media coverage and Cold War-style rhetoric, it is disturbingly easy for politicians or journalists to leap from viewing such a transaction as a routine business exchange to proof of Chinese subversion. Second, access to this information is profoundly inequitable. The so-called leaks were not made public or subjected to independent scrutiny, where scholars, civil society groups, or the general public could test or verify the claims. Instead, they were passed selectively to a small circle of journalists who then interpreted and framed the material for the entire country. Ogasawara suggests that this is more than just questionable journalism. It effectively transformed journalists into stenographers for the intelligence community and the press into a vehicle for state propaganda. By accepting and reporting these CSIS leaks as truths, reporters became intermediaries for an intelligence service that could shape public debate while remaining insulated from accountability or cross-examination. Third, the standards of journalism fall far short of those demanded in academia or law. In scholarly work, evidence must withstand peer review, and in the courts, claims must be proven with verifiable evidence. Journalists, however, can publish sweeping narratives on the basis of anonymous sources, unattributed briefings, or what insiders say. In the libel case arising from his reporting, Sam Cooper defended this practice by claiming that it was not a journalist's role to determine the truth, but simply to report competing claims. But in reality, when such stories are published under the banners of Global News or the Globe and Mail, the public does not treat them as speculative. They are read as credible accounts of reality. Rather than interrogating the motives behind the leaks or contextualizing the partial information being released, media reporting uncritically recycled CSIS narratives under the guise of investigative journalism. What emerged was not independent inquiry, but the amplification of a state-sanctioned storyline. This dynamic produced a feedback loop of moral panic. CSIS carefully selected fragments of intelligence, which were then transformed by the press into sensational exposés about alleged Chinese plots. These stories, presented as hard evidence of a shadowy conspiracy, were consumed by the public and framed as urgent threats. Politicians, in turn, cited the very media coverage that CSIS had seeded as justification for policy responses ranging from calls for a foreign influence registry to proposals for expanding the legal powers and operational scope of intelligence agencies. In short, far from holding power to account, the press in this case reinforced and legitimized the narratives planted by the intelligence community, helping to manufacture the very crisis they claimed only to be documenting. When the media frenzy, political theater, and intelligence leaks are viewed together, the foreign interference scandal begins to look less like a spontaneous eruption of concern and more like a carefully orchestrated psyop directed by CSIS. The outcome of the whole episode speaks volumes. CSIS emerged as the only institution to consolidate real strategic gains from the foreign interference scandal. The scandal failed to secure political wins for either major party. It led instead to the resignation of a weakened prime minister in January 2025. It failed to elevate Pierre Poilievre's conservatives into government. It fueled a wave of public anxiety and xenophobia. And it even destroyed the career of journalist Sam Cooper, who was sued for libel by Han Dong, whose career was also destroyed. But from the very beginning, CSIS positioned itself at the center of events. selectively leaking fragments of intelligence to hand-picked journalists, and in doing so, shaping the public agenda from the shadows. The result was a carefully manufactured political climate of fear, one that fostered suspicion towards China while legitimizing expanded security powers at home. But why would CSIS orchestrate this whole scandal? What broader strategy was this whole episode a part of? Well, until the sources and full content of the leaks is disclosed, their exact purpose remains uncertain, but we may speculate that part of the answer lies in the timing. Just weeks after the first wave of reports in November 2022, Ottawa rolled out its long-anticipated Indo-Pacific strategy. While presented as a neutral policy blueprint, Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy was in fact an alignment with Washington's pivot to Asia, a geopolitical reorientation that redefined China not as a partner or rising power to engage with, but as the chief threat to regional stability and the so-called rules-based international order. The document itself was notably thin on substantive policy prescriptions, more a collection of rhetorical commitments than a concrete plan. But it laid out the need to exploit economic opportunities in the emerging Asian markets while identifying China as a disruptive power seeking to reinterpret the rules and norms of the regional economy. In doing so, it provided a framework for Canada to justify embedding itself more deeply into US-led initiatives, including joint military exercises across the Pacific, all under the guise of securitizing trade routes and protecting supply chain resilience. The intelligence leaks orchestrated by CSIS dovetailed seamlessly with this shift. By strategically placing stories in mainstream media outlets, the agency reinforced the perception of China as an existential danger to Canadian sovereignty and democracy. Each sensational headline, no matter how reliant on ambiguous, fragmentary, or unverifiable intelligence, lent public legitimacy to the policy pivot already underway. In effect, the leaks served as a domestic propaganda tool, manufacturing public consent for a more confrontational stance towards Beijing, and ensuring that Ottawa's security realignment could be sold not as an elite-driven Indo-Pacific strategy, but as a defensive necessity born out of alleged Chinese interference. The scandal created the urgency for a sweeping expansion of CSIS powers through Bill C-70, an amendment that might have been politically unthinkable had it not been rushed through Parliament in a climate of fear. This new legislation authorized CSIS to collect, retain, and query massive data sets, including information on Canadian citizens. It granted powers to CSIS to compel organizations to hand over digital records through production orders. It extended broad new warrant powers, giving the agency unprecedented reach into communications, online platforms, and greater power to demand removal of digital content deemed linked to foreign interference. It also redefined CSIS's mandate under Section 16, clarifying its authority to gather foreign intelligence within Canada and share it seamlessly with allied agencies. In short, the agency, which was essentially at the root of the wave of false reports coming through the media, was now given even greater power to collect intelligence, further entrenching it as a proactive interventionist arm of the police state. CSIS essentially insulated itself from oversight while more deeply entrenching Canadian foreign policy with the US and its Five Eyes allies. In effect, even if future governments hesitate to escalate against China, the public narrative of interference and these new legislative frameworks have made backtracking politically costly, meaning that Ottawa may now be locked into a more confrontational posture towards China, regardless of its own diplomatic calculus. CSIS had long prepared the ground for this expansion of power in the name of confronting China. In 2018, it released a report titled China and the Age of Strategic Rivalry, which laid out CSIS's view of China as well as Canada's top national security interests. It describes China as a form of authoritarian capitalism, resting on the centralization of power not only through the CPC, but through Xi Jinping as an individual. It identifies China's high-tech sector as the greatest strategic challenge, noting the emergence of Chinese smart cities and e-government as a means of strengthening party control. It argues that the Belt and Road Initiative expands Beijing's global economic footprint, while its cross-border interbank system challenges US dollar dominance. It also claims that all Chinese companies, even in the private sector, are tightly controlled by the Communist Party, obligating them to serve China's national interests in disputes such as Taiwan or the South China Sea. Most significantly, the report claimed that Beijing curtails freedom of expression abroad, seeks to influence ethnic Chinese communities, and purchases control of overseas Chinese language media outlets through its United Front initiatives. Here we can connect further motives that CSIS may have had in instigating the moral panic. For decades, Canadian foreign policy had assumed indefinite US supremacy, but in recent years, the Chinese economy has seen extraordinary growth, with its burgeoning high-tech sector now outcompeting the US in several fields, while its regional influence continues to concretize its political power. In short, China's rapid ascent has triggered a panic in Washington, a mix of denial, irrationality, and desperation. But as a loyal partner, Canada is being swept up in the response and caught between two global powers, as was the case with the arrest of Meng Wanzhou in 2018. Seen through this lens, the foreign interference scandal looks less like an accident than a trial run, a way to test how effective selective leaks could be in generating moral panic and justifying a new Cold War footing. For CSIS, the whole episode had been a successful rehearsal. The agency tested its tools, gauged the media's responsiveness, and expanded its powers, all without accountability or consequence. For years, Canadian audiences were bombarded with allegations of Chinese plots and networks, implicating not only Beijing, but also Chinese Canadians and Chinese migrants, recasting them as suspects rather than citizens. The social consequences of this xenophobic messaging have been severe and widespread. Statistics Canada indicates that police-reported hate crimes against Asians have more than doubled since 2019, while the Canadian Race Relations Foundation found that physical attacks on Chinese Canadians had tripled during the same time period. The parallels to the past are unmistakable. Just as the Yellow Peril myth cast Chinese migrants as a foreign threat, infiltrating the nation and undermining Western values, today's accusations portray the Chinese Canadian middle class as potential agents of Beijing, undermining Canadian democracy from within. Compounded with an additional layer of Cold War imagery, this framing reduces Chinese citizens abroad to presumed tools of the Communist Party, uncritical, obedient, and mindless drones of Beijing. Unlike earlier waves of hostility directed at poor laborers, this new xenophobia disproportionately targets influential figures, such as business people trading with China, politicians resisting the demonization of China, academics critical of Ottawa's confrontational policies, or journalists that do not peddle CSIS narratives. By contrast, Chinese diaspora groups openly opposed to Beijing, such as the Falun Gong or Uyghur and Tibet advocacy organizations, are treated as allies because they are willing to make outlandish accusations against China. In this binary world of friends and enemies, neutrality itself becomes suspect. Chinese Canadians who fail to adequately condemn Beijing, communism, or Xi Jinping personally are cast with suspicion, perhaps as infiltrators or even traitors. Their loyalty to Canada might be questioned like the Ukrainian Canadians during World War I or Japanese Canadians during World War II. The foreign interference scandal has revived this fifth column narrative, laying a dangerous new foundation for the stigmatization of an entire community. In light of this social harm, one of the most astonishing aspects of the foreign interference scandal was how no one of consequence was ever held publicly accountable for manufacturing the panic. Sam Cooper was privately sanctioned by Global News, who let him go, and was further held to account by Han Dong, who filed a libel lawsuit against him. Yet his counterparts at the Globe and Mail, Robert Fife and Stephen Chase, were not only unpunished, but celebrated, receiving the prestigious Charles Lynch and Ross Munro Awards for their investigative journalism on Chinese foreign interference. The irony here is staggering. After years of publishing over 100 articles smacked with outlandish claims that ultimately collapsed under scrutiny, two of the journalists most responsible for spreading this misinformation were awarded for their work. Moreover, the real architect of the foreign interference scandal, CSIS, escaped any meaningful scrutiny. No inquiry examined how the agency curated intelligence, leaked it to selected journalists, or steered the national agenda. In fact, CSIS not only avoided consequences, it emerged stronger and was able to even use useful idiots in the NDP to put a progressive veneer on a bill that significantly expanded the powers of the police state. In my personal opinion, the scale and coordination of the leaks make it unlikely that they came from a lone whistleblower, and far more likely that they reflected a deliberate strategy by senior officials to direct the intelligence community in such a way that would harden Canada's stance towards China while shielding the agency from accountability. The final inquiry report made it evident that allegations of Chinese interference in Canada were rooted primarily in the activities linked to the United Front Works Department. The Communist Party of China does operate a United Front program designed to strengthen cultural and political ties with the Chinese diaspora. This effort manifests in several forms: ambassadors cultivating relationships with local organizations, Beijing funding and staffing Confucius institutes abroad to teach Mandarin, Chinese history, and philosophy, and the promotion of Chinese language media outlets that serve diaspora communities within Canada. However, there is nothing inherently unusual about these practices. Canada's multicultural fabric is sustained in part by a wide variety of diaspora communities that preserve their languages and cultural identities through embassies, community associations, educational institutions, and ethnic media. Likewise, it is normal for embassies to establish connections with influential community leaders or to cultivate preferred partners for future collaboration. Even the widely reported donation to the Pierre Elliott Trudeau Foundation, though ultimately returned under political and media pressure, was neither illegal nor a violation of ethical standards. Despite this context, CSIS recast these people-to-people exchanges as instruments of political interference. In its framing, community organizations were seen as collaborating with Communist Party officials based in Chinese embassies. Confucius institutes were portrayed as vehicles for spreading communist ideology, and Chinese language media was depicted as a channel for alternative narratives meant to undermine English language outlets. Together, these activities were presented as part of a strategy to consolidate Beijing's influence over the Chinese diaspora in Canada. However, what this narrative obscures is that Western states, including Canada, have long engaged in comparable and at times more direct interventions in China. Ottawa regularly condemns Beijing's domestic policies on Hong Kong, Xinjiang, Tibet, and Taiwan. In 2024, Canadian delegations traveled to Taiwan, which Beijing regarded as a challenge to its sovereignty and a signal of tacit support for Taiwanese independence. Canada also participates in intelligence gathering and US-led naval exercises in the South China Sea, waters that China views as central to its internal disputes. And Canadian parliamentarians such as Jenny Kwan openly champion dissident groups within China, many of which are supported with their messages amplified by Western media outlets like Radio Free Asia. Furthermore, while China, Russia, Iran, or Venezuela are often portrayed as the main threats of foreign interference, the deeper reality is that Canada's independence is most compromised by its closest ally, the United States. Through economic leverage, trade agreements, and military alliances like NATO, NORAD, or the Five Eyes, Washington keeps Canadian foreign policy tethered to US strategic objectives. Once again, the 2018 arrest of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou at America's request exposed just how little room Ottawa has for independent decision-making, especially when it comes to questions of foreign policy. Earlier this year, the US even threatened to annex Canada, which goes far beyond any interference threats, real or imaginary, posed by the People's Republic of China. Canada also experiences foreign interference from allied countries like Israel, through proxy organizations such as the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, which lobbies politicians and puts pressure on media outlets to mute criticism of Israeli policy. Pro-Israel groups and consulates monitor student and activist movements opposing the occupation of Palestine, branding critics as anti-Semitic in an effort to silence dissidents. Even more troubling, despite the Foreign Enlistment Act of 1937, which prohibits foreign militaries from recruiting on Canadian soil, Israeli consulates and affiliated organizations openly funnel Jewish Canadian youth towards enlistment in the Israeli Defense Forces. However, one of the most blatant cases of foreign interference in recent years has come from India. In the midst of the foreign interference scandal, Sikh separatist leader Hardeep Singh Nijjar was gunned down in Surrey, British Columbia. Canadian authorities later arrested several Indian nationals and announced that they had credible evidence suggesting that the Indian government was directly involved in orchestrating the assassination, which India denies. These examples represent profound violations of Canadian sovereignty, yet unlike the frenzy around alleged Chinese interference, these cases involving the US, Israel, or India did not trigger a media witch hunt, coordinated intelligence leaks, a surge of racism, or a sweeping public inquiry. This is because these countries are considered Canada's allies, while the whole point of demonizing China is that it is considered an economic adversary and threat to Western hegemony. As the CSIS document reveals plainly, China's economic and technological growth have enabled it to proceed along an alternative course of development from the Western so-called rules-based international order. In short, China is no longer the global sweatshop for producing Western goods, but a competitor that seeks equality with Western nations. In conclusion, Canada finds itself in an awkward, even contradictory position. On the one hand, it has doubled down on US hegemony, aligning its policies with Washington's Indo-Pacific containment strategy and sanctions regime, supplemented through a steady flow of anti-China rhetoric. On the other hand, Canada has also faced open hostility from its supposed ally, sanctions, tariffs, and threats of transforming Canada into a 51st state. This has forced Canada to diversify its risk and relationship on the international stage, and in a painfully humbling twist of fate, it has now turned to China as a leading partner in future trade, diplomacy, and cooperation. Canada is currently engaging in a series of trade negotiations with China, marking a significant pivot that is much more favorable to both countries. Only time will tell how effective this will be in calming anxieties around Chinese authoritarianism and interference. The Chinese foreign interference scandal was a very messy episode, one with links and connections all over the place. But in an attempt to summarize the totality of this issue, I'll draw on a quote from the Chinese consulate in Vancouver, who may have summarized the issue best. Canada's Foreign Interference Commission made groundless accusations and smears against China. China firmly opposes this and strongly condemns it. China has always been upholding the non-interference principle in internal affairs and has never interfered in the internal affairs of Canada, nor is interested in doing so. Meanwhile, China will never accept any slander and smear against China, and firmly opposes the Canadian side's blatant interference in China's internal affairs on issues such as Taiwan, Hong Kong, Xinjiang, and Tibet, and will take all necessary measures to resolutely safeguard China's legitimate and lawful rights and interests. Lies cannot hide the truth, and justice lies in the hearts of the people. China urges the Canadian side to reflect on itself, abandon its double standards and ideological biases, immediately stop its groundless attacks and smears against China, stop interfering in China's internal affairs, and take real actions to safeguard the efforts of both sides to promote a healthy and stable development of China-Canada relations.